Well, there are a few ideas behind the mpavilion. We felt that Melbourne could be the centre of architecture and design for Australia and Southeast Asia, that Melbourne has beautiful architecture, and we felt that an idea which supported architecture and design could work really well in the community. It was very important that each pavilion was designed by an architect who had an individual language, an architectural language which would bring something new to the table, and that included Australian architects as well. But it was important to have global architects that students could learn from, practitioners could learn from, people could see how they interpreted the way that life was going to be lived with a community. In 2022, Rashapon Chuchui from All Zone in Bangkok delivered a gorgeous, multi-layered, fabric-covered pavilion, unlike anything else we'd ever seen in Australia. It just billowed with bright colour, which sat exquisitely against the green canopy of the gardens. It was so inventive and clever. Rashapon described herself as the conductor of all the innovative people who contributed to making this such a special mpavilion.
First of all, the mpavilion has to be a little bit of a landmark. People have to see it from far away, and so that they will be drawn into it.
What we're seeing now with Rashapur, which is about an awareness of materials and an awareness of the challenges of today. If we think about climate change, if we think about decarbonisation of the construction industry, these are all big conversations we're having. So we've got some huge challenges, and I think Rashapur confronts that with her pavilion.
I mean, I know her work, her use of materials is amazing in that she's using soft fabrics, and she deals with light in a really interesting way. I guess my interest is in fashion and textile design and how that translates into architecture, so I kind of jumped at the chance to work with her. She's an unbelievably generous designer, very collaborative.
I think that's one of the major successes in these pavilions, is trying to balance that notion of frugality and generosity. There's a great deal of generosity in terms of these being gifts to the city.
So colour is a really critical part of it. Again, that references back to the vibrant culture that Ratchapon's and All Zone are, working in. All of that's been very carefully thought out, sort of the orange and the yellow. And I think it's also the colour that will flood the ground plane as well.
When you talk about buildings, you're like, boom, something very monumental, straight, stable, steel and all that. But we want to give a little bit the different perspective of architecture, that it could be soft, it could be slightly moving, it could be also fun and playful.
It's amazing to think that something so modest in scale has had such a profound impact in its short lifespan. And I'm saying short lifespan, I mean it's 9 years of commissioning.
The mpavilion isn't a building because it's a structure to provide shade. It doesn't typically have walls around it. It doesn't have plumbing and services and mechanical. It's a covering to provide protection from the rain, from the sun, and to provide an architectural space that realises the mpavilion program.
Like Nigel said, okay, you want this? I think it's possible, but something like this always. Maybe we have to sacrifice this for this, and let's work it out.
The All Zone pavilion is really interesting because the concept was for a pavilion that was relaxed, a fabric net covering that looked relaxed, with the concept of post-COVID. There was something that wasn't wanted to be, there was no tension wanted in it. But inherently with a fabric structure, you use tension to control movement of the fabric. So realising something that inherently was supposed to look draped and hanging and loose, and yet needed to behave and not fatigue and fail under wind loading and flap and move is an inherent challenge.
The concept was very simple. The idea that Ratchapon had was that it was to be a shelter, like a tree, and her thoughts were really the fact that it had to be something. People were coming out from a 2-year hiatus in lockdown, and she wanted something that was playful, somewhere where people could relax and sit down. And that all sounded very well, and she created this imagery of that. But the difficult part was that she wanted to study how light would go through various things, like a tree has leaves, foliage. At the same time, also something that would give rain shelter as well. And so it started out as a single layer, and she started drawing 3 layers and became something quite complex.
So the top layer is a net, and that's actually a fishing net. Very hard wearing. It's used to catching fish in the ocean and being exposed to sun, so it's actually quite hard wearing.
We have the middle layer of the roof, which will be translucent material that would collect all the rains.
And then the bottom layer, which is the kind of celebration that most people will engage with, is a outdoor shade cloth material that's been sewn into a kind of waffle pattern that will move. And so that's the genius of the whole pavilion, is that it'll be a permanent structure that will have movement, so you'll see ripples of wind run through it.
I needed to understand how the material works, and the architects need to understand how the light comes through, and everybody needed to know how this thing come together. It's like 3 pieces of a puzzle.
It's been changing into the form that I didn't expect, but that's great.
I think one of the things that we've always found is that there is a time to design something, and then a time to sort of work out details on it. Then there's a time to sort of make and manufacture the elements, and then there's a time to build it.
It's not a folly, so none of the projects have ever been follies, and that is what is very different, and that's turned around like less than a year. So the concept to working through the designs to implementation is done in a year, which is like phenomenal.
But what we've tried to do here is really a lot of things are happening in tandem to be able to try and compress it.
So Ratchaporn came to us with this concept of this beautiful, relaxed structure with this fantastic draped soffit, under the roof. And wanted this feeling of, complete relaxation as this sort of post-COVID world concept, and realizing a tension structure, which typically, a fabric structure has tension to control it. If you don't do that and the wind blows, it flaps and lifts. So realizing that concept into something that was going to give her that sense of relaxation, but also perform in a structural way, in a dependable structural way that doesn't flap and make noise and flick rain on people, was a massive challenge given the complexity and experimental nature of what we're often doing.
I think people are going to be blown away because it is a pavilion and it's functioning as a piece of architecture. It's watertight, it's dealing with sun, and it has got some elements around program so that it can be used for performance and all the myriad of programs that run through the mpavilion.
I start working on the program once the architect's been announced, and then it's a case of really thinking about their practice and understanding what it is that they are motivated by. This year with Ratchaporn and the Thai Festival, the timing was the serendipity was kind of crazy because this year is the 70th year of diplomatic relations between Thailand and Australia. It wasn't necessarily an intention from Ratchaporn. She's very open to thinking about how the pavilion will be used by sort of Melbourne generally, and had no sort of predetermined ideas about there being a Thai festival, but I think it's something that she's felt quite warmly to as we've sort of explored the Thai artists and dancers who we're working with, and also the Thai Australian Chamber and the Thai Embassy, who've been really sort of influential in what's been happening for the festival.
One of the things I think is really important to recognise is that mpavilions become this really significant, not only event, but within the architectural and design world, it's been recognised now as a really significant commission. I think any architect that gets commissioned to do an mpavilion is really getting put on a global stage. The people that are invited along are really carefully considered, and they're carefully considered in the context of what we're talking about in Melbourne. Why is it relevant to Melbourne? but what does it mean in a global context?
I'm sure that if you ask all the architects or engineers, they want to build better. They want to create a better way of living, better use of natural resources. But then, how could they do that with the mechanism we are dealing with in building construction industry? I don't think they think this as an art piece. And if you look at all the architects who've been working in the mpavilion, I think they're all focused on how architecture could be. And we try to follow the footsteps as well.
There's a real craft in what she's doing. It's a lovely metaphor, this idea of the fishing nets and the weaving of materials. But the weaving of stories and cultural narratives, I think, is a lovely metaphor as well. It's taken me to Bangkok.
It's always been a happy place. It's always been a place of contemplation and joy. It's always been a place where people have come together. Some people have called it a utopian space, a place where anything can happen. And that's what we wanted from it.
Warmen Schenker, Bunwara, Yara Kutuela.